is Jaap De Zwaan, so the first slide, I was mixed up with another colleague who is teaching somewhere else in this building. It's not Trinity, but it's Erasmus University, Rotterdam. In fact, I'm a lawyer, so be aware of that background. I started my professional career as a member of the bar in The Hague, in the Netherlands. Then I switched to the Foreign Office. And that's where I got acquainted to the asylum and immigration issues of the European Union, because that was at that time relatively topical in view of the negotiations on the Treaty of Maastricht. I don't know whether you can more or less indicate what period I'm talking about. It's so the beginning of the 90s, when I was involved in the Dutch presidency preparing the Treaty of Maastricht, and in the content of which treaty we have introduced the whole domain of justice and home affairs cooperation in the agenda, in the program of the European Union. And after that, after some 18, 19 years, I switched to full academic life as a professor of European Union law, so full-time professor at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. I stimulated another switch as the director of the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, Klingendaal Institute. But then later on, I came back to Erasmus University. The idea is to talk to you, at least to the, properly speaking, the students for this course for 3 days. And we will deal with the issue of asylum, migration, law and policy, properly speaking. Today I wanted to focus more particularly on the general context, the whole, the conflict, the crisis which has been experienced so intensively here in Greece, when the crisis, the migration crisis was as it hit in 2015. So I want to go over to give you that kind of context. Where are we talking about? And certainly the number of migrants coming in legally, either illegally, in the European Union has decreased sharply even, but the crisis is not yet over. So the idea is to talk today about the more global context of migration and asylum. And also I want to take on board the topic of border control and visa policy. And then the idea is to switch tomorrow to the whole area of asylum law and policy, and on the Wednesday to immigration, plus the criminal dimension of asylum and immigration law. And I wanted also to, in order to update you on this this rather global problem, a little bit on the future agenda of the European Union, because migration is one of the big issues which is now on the table of our heads of state and government as they gather in the framework of the European Council. And so in view of the still existing disagreements between the member states, the president of the European Council, Mr. Donald Tusk, has scheduled a program which is running from October last year until essentially June 2019. I want to update you a little bit on where we are with this issue. And perhaps it's fun to start putting you a question, which is, why do you think the European Union is in need of preparing a proper asylum and immigration policy? Why we could not leave these kind of issues to the member states themselves? I don't know whether you have an idea. You can make a guess, and we will see how far we can get with it. But why is it that Europe, the European Union, felt more or less committed, obliged even, to develop its own asylum and immigration law and policy? Why is that, do you think? What is the linkage with the EU agenda as we know it from the 50s, from the 60s, when this whole international organization was established after the Second World War? Who would like to make a guess? why we need an EU dimension, asylum and immigration law and policy, especially the students who have participated in the introductory courses might be able to at least start to give a beginning of an answer on this question. What do you think? What is the logic of developing such a policy in the EU framework? Yes, please. Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that's the point. But of course, these kind of events happened in 2015, 2016. The Balkan route, I have a slide, I brought a slide to show you how that was developed. But of course, then we are referring to 2015-16. And indeed, member states behaving slightly autonomously, independently. But there is a background context to the EU. Why have we created the European Union, for example? What was the first, the first objective when we created this European Union, at the time, by the way, called the European Economic Community. So it's an economic context I'm looking for. What's your guess? What about the internal market? Have you heard talking about the internal market? Certainly, because everything what we are talking about, migration, asylum, is linked to the internal market, to the extent that we have created, so in the 50s, this European Economic Community, which essentially had as its main objective to establish a common market, which later on was called an internal market. And an internal market, obviously, is characterized by free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital. And that's the whole issue. It took us about, to really abolish all the internal barriers with regard to movement of goods. It took us only some 15 years. It was not that much of a problem. However, there is, of course, the more serious problem, and I leave aside services, which is a very complicated sector in a way, but free movement of persons in order to implement and to realize that kind of treaty objective. It took us quite a while, some decades even. And why was that? Because, of course, sitting here in EPLO, meeting here in EPLO, everybody with its own academic background. So it requires not only that you allow dependents and workers to enter into the market, the labor market of another member state, but it also requires that academic, qualified people have the possibility to enter the labor market in another member state. Same goes for the independents, but also the independents. So businessmen and women, certainly, if you want to open up possibilities for development their professional activities in another member state, you have to provide for all kinds of liberation measures, which took us quite a while. So mutual recognition of diplomas, to mention an example, is a topic which was solved some 30, 35 years after we started the whole operation, and still there are some difficulties with regard, for example, the mutual recognition of a master diploma of a lawyer. So LLM, how you want to call it, master degree, etc. It sometimes still gives rise to... Now, certainly, looking back to what we have achieved, internal markets at that level, I think we can more or less conclude that that has been established. But of course, once you create such a free internal common market where you have abolished internal border controls, whether it is identity controls, but also whether it's checking of your professional qualifications, because the idea is mutual recognition, non-discrimination. When you migrate from one member state to another, and then in principle your diploma or whatever professional qualification have to be mutually recognized by the authorities of another member state. And what does that mean with regard to the situation at the external borders? And there we start talking about, obviously, also third country nationals coming in or going out. But when we talk about migration, immigration and asylum, certainly the focus is on those third country nationals coming in to the European Union. However, there's also a category of third country nationals already linked to this idea of an internal market. Can you think about what is the linkage of a third country national to the internal market? So I have to make clear in this perspective that certainly the idea was to facilitate the position of EU citizens, so nationals of EU members, but nevertheless there are situations where also third country nationals are coming in and may profit from this idea of free movement of persons, non-discrimination in another member state, in the host member state. So you have the country of origin and the host member state. In which context third country nationals are linked to the internal market. It should not be that difficult. So the larger context, a third country national who may profit from the facilities offered by the internal market. What about family life? Family life? Exactly. Yeah. So family members. And that's an intriguing business. I mean, certainly, and rightly so. Of course, if you allow an EU migrant, a Dutch national, who was qualified as an engineer or an architect, who want to continue his professional career in Greece, for example, he might bring his family. And that's, of course, an issue where the EU legislator has to think about. And essentially, we have created, in the context of the internal market, a rather large concept of family life, which really corresponds to the requirements also of the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedom, Article 8, the right to family life. So it's rather extensively, essentially, all family members being dependent of the primary beneficiary, whatever their age is, I dare to say, they may profit from this concept of family life, family members, but connected to the primary beneficiary in the context of the internal market. And obviously, we will also talk about this issue of family reunification in the context of asylum and immigration law. However, we will notice tomorrow and the day after that that concept has been drafted in a slight more modest sense. So whereas in the internal market context, family life really includes dependent ascendants, but also the descendants, whatever their age is, to the extent dependent of the primary beneficiary. That is not the situation with regard to asylum and immigration. But that essentially is the reason why the European Union has to deal with its own policy with regard to accession of third country nationals coming from a third country to the European Union. Yes, Vasilij.
You also consider that there's a conjectural element we started having this policy back in 1990, which is a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, opening up the borders of the neighboring countries of the EU, about the structure.
Yes.
About the structural reasons for having migration policy.
Yes, it is. It is essentially. In fact, the discussion started already when I was posted, because I was posted twice at our permanent representation in Brussels as the legal advisor, and in the second instance as the head of the Justice and Home Affairs Department. In fact, we started to discuss these issues already in the 80s, so before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the application which came in from the newly independent states of Central and Eastern Europe, who had the ambition to become a member of the European Union. In fact, we started a discussion already in the 80s, because it's crystal clear that once you try to accomplish free movement within the EU at the time, so Greece came in 81, and we were only, how many member states we were at that time? We were only 10. So Spain, Portugal, I was involved in that treaty negotiations. They came in 86, 87 only, so but we were 10. But certainly if you abolish all kind of internal controls with regard to qualification, you allow the worker to have access to the internal market, to bring his family and whatsoever, you bump into this other aspect, which is the control of identities at the borders. And we, of course, not everybody here in this room, but we have experienced that when we went on holiday, there were quite some queues at the border on the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and whatsoever. And this was an issue which came up already in the 80s. And at that time, it was very funny that there were several member states, including my member state, so the Netherlands, who were of the opinion that that issue could easily be linked to the EEC, because it's an obvious linkage with free movement of person. But, of course, this issue on control, passport control, identity control, has another dimension as well. What is that other dimension as well? So the problem with Justice and Home Affairs coming in the program of the European Union, well, makes sometimes member states a bit reluctant because of the fact you touch upon their public order, national security, criminal law, police kind of systems. So you really, as I always call it, you touch upon the roots of national society. So to abolish the passport control, when I flew from Amsterdam to Greece, essentially my passport was not checked at all. Although the idea of Schengen is that you have to be checked at least at the country of departure. When you are leaving a member state, you're not supposed to be controlled once arriving in another Schengen state, here in Essen. But in Amsterdam, I was only marginally checked, which is very funny. But okay, but that leaving aside, I mean, passport control, identity control is an issue of huge importance with regard to public security, and you can understand why that is so. And I mention that because this element, this relationship with public order and public security, not to say national security, made member states reluctant to discuss, let alone decide about this issue in the context of the EEC. And why was that? Because the EEC is something different than, obviously, the member states, or, let me say, a member state organized in the context of a federation. So, the European Union, as at least the students have learned, is an international organization which practiced essentially in the first 30, 40 years the famous supranational procedures, which implies the right of initiative of the European Commission, a qualified majority voting on the Council, a full-fledged co-legislative power of the European Parliament, and a controlling entity in Luxembourg, the Court of Justice. So this is a number of characteristics. We refer to them like the supranational ones. And when we were discussing the abolish passport control, ministers of justice, ministers of the interior were very reluctant to hand this subject matter over to this kind of behavior, this kind of proceeding. European Commission having the exclusive right of initiative to propose the modalities how to abolish these passport controls, etc. And that was the reason why essentially we dealt with this issue, but not in the context of the EEC, but in the context of what is the first intergovernmental framework of cooperation with regard to movement of persons when it focuses on the abolishment of passport controls. Have you heard about? Greece is a Schengen state, and of course it was Schengen, so which was in fact the framework where it has been officially decided to abolish the passport controls in the framework of entry and departure between member states. And that was the Schengen framework. However, differently than the EEC, this was framed into an intergovernmental context. So, member states essentially having to decide on this issue by consensus. So no interference of supranational mechanisms, or the right of initiative, European Commission, qualified majority voting in the Council, the European Parliament having co-legislative, etc., etc. So this was originally this decided upon in an intergovernmental framework. And then, of course, later on, when the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, and as a consequence, these political developments of extreme importance in European history, so the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of the countries of Central Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War, and not only collapse of the Soviet Union, but the emergence of new independent states, the former Soviet republics, the Commonwealth of Independent States, as it was called at the time. That was a development of extreme importance, and it was in fact thanks to the efforts and the ideas and the vision of the famous leaders, the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who passed away, what was it, last year, and his French colleague, François Mitterrand, that they were in fact at the beginning of a new program, and they in fact, were the visionary people who provided for a broader program where the economic dimension of the internal market was connected to other issues, such as the justice and home affairs cooperation, including the external dimension, such as the common foreign and security policy, which is the framework for foreign policy and defense cooperation within the European Union, and the EMU, the Economic and Monetary Union. So they were in fact the inventors of this much more broader agenda. And once this was settled and decided upon, that took a while, because it was not a very easy task for the Dutch presidency at that time. I remember that still very well, but nevertheless. And then, of course, Justice, Home Affairs, including migration, asylum, was taken on board of the EU, of the EU kind of catalogue of competences and responsibilities. However, it was framed and organized a bit differently. And that's the final thing I want to say about that. It took us, in fact, until the Lisbon Treaty, which is a treaty only entered into force in 2009, so it's still 8 years running now, that we really can say that also the whole area of asylum and migration is now involved, integrated in a properly speaking European Union framework where the normal procedures, right of initiative, qualified majority voting, co-legislative powers of the European Parliament, and the controlling responsibilities of the Court of Justice is of application. So it took us quite a while. So we have to go back to Schengen in the 80s, 85, implementing convention dating to 91, if I'm not mistaken, but it entered into force only in 95. In the meantime, the Treaty of Maastricht was entering into force. And then, of course, it took us quite some time before we finally, but not least, can now argue that this issue is now fully fledged EU competence, essentially, I would say by and large, 70–80%. This is an area, because it's cross-boundary in its characteristic, it is an EU competence of big importance, but relatively new. So, and I was involved right from the start of this kind of new beginning of a new domain of expertise and cooperation. I brought this subject matter to the university, and I tried to get hold of all the updates and so on, and still a fascinating area where we have solved quite some issues, but we have not solved all of them. And then certainly we come back to your observation with regard to what happened in 2015. Because, let's put it this way, What is now the problem? So internal market is being secured and safeguarded by common controls at the external borders. And certainly migration is an issue of all ages. However, what happened in 2014, 2015, I will show you the slides in a while. Of course, we were confronted with an enormous number of people coming in the European Union through legal passages, but essentially also by illegal transport mechanisms. And they were really over-flooding the European Union, as we have experienced. So what went wrong in that context in the 2015? Essentially, the real crisis, if you want to focus on the real crisis, September, October, November 2015, there was a Turkey deal to try to keep them in their area where they were coming from, and then reference was essentially to Syrian refugees, by the way. That was an event being developed and decided upon in springtime 2016. Now numbers are going down, but the problem has not yet gone away, so we have to live with that. What was the problem? Was the European Union prepared? Now, apparently not, because as you argued, at a certain moment each individual member state acted a bit differently with regard to how to deal with these people coming in by train or by boat, and many of them drowned, by the way, in their efforts, smuggled or not, over the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea here from Turkey to Greece. They drowned, which was, of course, a very important human tragedy. The issue is we were not prepared, apparently. And as far as I can analyze the situation, we were not prepared because there were several warnings. So we were aware, obviously, of what was happening in the Middle East, the civil war in Syria, which was going on since 2011, 12, 13. We were aware of the problems in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Tunisia, Libya, still Libya is in a situation of conflict, turmoil, and how you want to call it. So there were enough signals. They were more or less neglected, essentially because the European Union and also the highest political level, European Council, they were so upset about problems related to the economic crisis. And Greece, unfortunately, is a country which has suffered from both crises and is still suffering, perhaps, from both crises. The migration crisis, but also the economic crisis. And that, of course, is an issue which has to be discussed. Because once you are presenting that framework of a common market, a common economic space, which is complemented by external border controls, and we even wrote these kind of principles down in the treaty, solidarity and burden sharing has to be practiced. So obviously, once you have created this internal market characterized by free movement, then of course you have to accept that also issues having their origin in a third country but affecting the external borders is a common responsibility, which has more or less been neglected. And we will come perhaps tomorrow when we are discussing all the legislative measures the European Union has adopted. I think in theory the European Union was prepared to deal with the crisis, because we have put in place, not only all the member states were bound to the Convention of Geneva, the Protocol of New York, which was after the Second World War, of course, the international framework, which called for protection of those in need of protection, the properly speaking refugees who have to fear for their lives because of prosecution, because of their political opinions and what of their activities and so on. That was crystal clear. And even in the first decade of the present era, we have set up and established legislative measures about responsible member states, how to receive migrants which are applying for asylum and so forth. By the way, in the meantime, we had experienced these horrifying events in the Balkans. The Balkan, not the Balkan wars, but of course the crisis, the civil war in the former socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, which gave rise to new concepts which had already been adopted and accepted at the EU level, and which we refer to until this day either as subsidiary protection, so because there the background for the Muslims, the Croats, the Serbs who were fighting each other was not so much their political convictions, their political activities, but simply their ethnical background. Because they are a Muslim, they are kicked out of their homes, their cities, their streets, and whatsoever. And that gave rise, which was very clever, in fact, as the European Union has reacted to that crisis, to new concepts. The one was subsidiary protection. So if it's not a refugee, which was the properly speaking refugee, was to fear for their life and prosecuting political activity, but for other reasons, discrimination and so on. And in this case, in the Balkans, the ethnical background, they had to be protected, which was accepted at the EU level. And we accepted this kind of subsidiary protection already in the first decade of this century. So, fine. We even accepted the notion of displaced persons, which was in fact the same group of people, especially the Muslims who were thrown out of Croatia or Serbia, or it were the Croats who were thrown out by the Serbs, and they are massively migrating to countries like Austria and Hungary. We have really reacted on that kind of horrible events by creating displaced persons. So these are people which have flooded their homes, are not able to return, and are obviously in need of protection. And of course their situation, whether they can be qualified as refugee or in the framework of subsidiary protection, has to be analyzed, has to be assessed. But nevertheless, it's a problem which is urgent. We have to deal with it urgent, and that's what we have proclaimed. Displaced people which are in need of protection have to be protected. So that was also a rather good result of the EU. However, the crisis in 2015 and 16 has completely overtaken ourselves because we were simply not prepared. This country was not prepared, Italy was not prepared, but let me put it very honestly, the whole European Union was not prepared. So we have put in place legislation. We were able to designate responsible countries to deal with migrants coming in from third countries. But in view of the numbers, we have been completely overtaken by events. And that was the silly thing which created this horrifying crisis in 2015-16, and still people are coming in, I suppose, also here on the Greek islands, but now more particularly so the whole Eastern Mediterranean wave was the first one. Now we are experiencing the Central Mediterranean wave, so the people coming still from the Middle East, but essentially from the poor countries or countries in conflict in Central Africa, but also from North Africa, so the Central wave. And there is a third one upcoming from Morocco, entering into Spain, and I also brought with me some slides on that. Now, so that means, as we are discussing, just kind of by way of introduction, we need a European answer to this because we have created ourselves this nice and interesting concept of the common market. And this common market, in fact, requires that we're not only organizing ourselves with regard to free movement internally, but also how to react on movements coming from outside third countries. In fact, there is a parallel with trade. I mean, free movement of goods is one of the fundamental freedoms of the internal market, but we had already created in the 60s and in the 70s of the last century the famous concept of the common commercial policy, which is in fact is the equivalent of what asylum and immigration is when we are focusing on movement of persons. I hope you understand that. So free movement of goods internally, has also a component externally, which has been developed and established already in the 60s, 70s, and that is the term of the common commercial policy. So the European Union, European Community at that time, is exclusively competent to deal with the formerly called GATT business, so trade in goods, and now as it's one of the components of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, this is an exclusive competence of the European Union to deal with these issues. I'm not referring to services and persons and capital, but essentially when the GATT concept, so that was the World Organization to Liberalize Trade in Goods, that's in fact the equivalent of what we are talking about these days when we are discussing asylum immigration matters. So that's crystal clear, an issue which is a common responsibility of the European Union, and that's of course one of my reference to solidarity and burden share. We have to deal with these issues as a collectivity. We cannot leave it in the hands and of the countries, in this case, with regard to the migration crisis, the southern countries, Greece, Italy, and essentially also Spain in this respect. Now, if I simply perhaps continue still before starting to show you some schemes and statistics on all this, the refugee crisis, as we are still referring to it, although the crisis is a little bit over its height, that was 2015-16, but nevertheless the problematic of migration has of course several dimensions, and that's also something which we have really to separate during our today's lecture and the ones of tomorrow and Wednesday. So of course the first dimension is the situation in the countries of origin. And in 2015 essentially the big influx came from Syria. So how to deal with this problem? Not very easy for the European Union to interfere in a civil war in a country. So the European Union is not used to really exercise military power and to intervene in a country, etc., etc. So that's a very difficult issue. With regard to the situation as it's demonstrated itself by now, so the situation in Central Africa, it may be a little bit easier. But if we are referring to countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Niger, and all these countries where there are still Congo, Central Africa, so the whole area, it's not very easy as well to intervene in these, and try to stabilize the situation. But it's a very important issue. In fact, in November last year, there was an EU-Africa summit taking place, where indeed the focus was essentially, that was also, by the way, the request of many of our political leaders. Mine, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands was one of them, really wanted to, how can we stop migration to take place? Well, not very easy. For Syria, it was more or less excluded to try to stabilize, to create peace and whatever in Syria was a bit difficult. In Africa, that's our next target. And the idea has been to establish a partnership with Africa, but with the help of the African Union. You know, that's a kind of similar international organization, active in the whole continent of Africa. UNHCR, so the High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration. So they're all involved in this effort, in this, well, this kind of approach to try to stabilize the central parts of Africa. Not very easy. And of course, if you want to achieve politically such an objective, you have to pay for it. So we're talking about billions and billions of euro, which are spent either by the EU from the development funds, but also by the member states. So it's in fact immense. In my reading list, I have started to list a kind of very recent materials. And I do not know all these figures by heart, but it's about billions and billions. We have not a clue about it. So a part of it is funded, well, essentially everything is funded indirectly or directly by the member states. But essentially, with regard to this Africa Fund, a first beginning is made by trying to fund 3.3 billion euro, out of which 1 will be financed from the development context, development funds, which has a focus on Africa. But the other 2 are distributed over the member states, dependent of gross national product. There are certain criteria, and then you can. It's an immense kind of issue. The same happened, by the way, with Turkey in 2016. It was a similar amount which was involved. Over 3 billion euro we paid to the Turkish government in order to try to prevent more illegal immigration taking place from Turkey to Greece, essentially at that time. So that is the first dimension, difficult to accomplish, how to stabilize the area of conflict, because we are confronted with people who have to run for their lives. Either they are refugees or they may profit from subsidiary protection, as we have developed that context in the EU, or they are displaced persons. Many of the Syrians were displaced persons, but obviously in clear need of protection. So we had to really apply our instruments for that. Then there is the second one, which is, of course, how to protect our external borders. We were not very eager on that. And perhaps we were eager, but we were not prepared on that. So if I refer to an EU agency, which has already been established in 2004, at least the regulation dates back to 2004, the Frontex. The obvious reference is to Frontières Extérieures, Frontex. It has its seat in Warsaw. Why in Warsaw? Well, first of all, it's a new member state, but the focus was to the east. And why the focus was to the east? Because Poland has to protect a new external border of the European Union with countries like Belarus, India, Moldova, and whatever, and Russia, of course, at the backside. In fact, Russia was already since the accession of Finland in '95 an external border. But okay, not given rise to many of these kind of problems. But the focus of Frontex originally was to control events taking place in the east. Whereas the crisis, as we all know, and the first references to the civil war in Syria, took place in the Mediterranean. So more or less, is it? So that's the point. We were not prepared for that. Yeah, who were prepared for that? Greece was prepared because it has a responsibility to protect the external border on all the islands, and all the islands, very tiny islands, very close to the Turkish coast, as I should not explain to this audience. So, and certainly also Italy was responsible to protect the external borders. But we were not prepared to deal with these high numbers. And the consequences, again, I should not explain that to you, but you have experienced that massively, and with all the effects still, well, you can see it still in the streets here, where I'm walking around a little bit at Plaka. You see them, the refugees, fine. Apparently they are protected, or they are in a process of assessment of their application or whatsoever. But this country has suffered enormously from this crisis. And similarly, for Italy, the same is true. So the external borders need to be controlled, but also organized, the external border control. Frontex has been obviously introduced in this phenomenon. However, that's typically the way the European Union is acting. Who is responsible to deal with the external border controls? These are the member states. It's not the European Union. It's not Frontex. It are the member states. And that's, of course, also an issue, but also a problem. Because then, of course, you are dependent of numbers of immigration officers, of ships, the Marines, or whatever. So it's a national organization. Frontex always plays a role in a subsidiary capacity, assisting the member states who has the responsibility for the external border control. This, of course, was in the 2015-16 a horrifying kind of situation, because the Greek authorities, the Italian authorities, were not able to deal with this high influx of migrants. So in the course of time, we have realized that the position and the responsibilities of front have to be reinforced. Has been done since the end of 2016. Now Frontex comes closer to the member states responsible for how to organize their external border controls, but still in a subsidiary capacity. It's very funny, if you read the text, it's very funny. Frontex can intervene when they notice deficiencies in the system, the Greek system, the Spanish system, the French system, the Italians. They can intervene, they can make observations, etc. But still it is essentially a first responsibility of the member states. But since 2016 we have put in place a whole group of guards, immigration officers coming from everywhere. And this is a reference to, perhaps a first reference to the position of a number of newcomers, the Visegrad countries, who are not very much willing to facilitate the situation here in Greece or in Italy, and that's the concept of relocation. So people applying for protection, whether they are refugees, beneficiaries of subsidiary protection, displaced persons, whatsoever, they are relocated. We have developed a mechanism to distribute them. We cannot leave them here purely on your islands, in Italy, Lampedusa and all these nice places, but we have to distribute them. And you are aware that a number of new member states from Eastern Europe, Poland, the Czechs, the Hungarians, but also the Romanians at the time, they were completely against participating in such a relocation. They were not willing to receive people whose application had to be assessed whether or not they are in need of protection, etc., etc. So that means that we have not yet come that far. But as I said, since 2016, in the framework of Frontex, we have created a kind of a guard of a couple of hundred immigration officers, and why not many of them coming from countries like Poland, Hungary. They do not have that much of experience how to handle application of refugees, because that was one of their problems. Culturally, they are not welcome. For religion, they are not welcome. So is there a lot of expertise? But nevertheless, it is a possibility for them to do something in an alternative capacity. If you are not willing to participate in the relocation kind of mechanism, you at least can perform better by making available human capacity or an infrastructure and so forth, shelters and so on, and these kind of things. So the external border is still rather fluid. It's not well organized. We are on the way to do something better. But that's at least the second dimension. So you have the first one was the situation in the country of origin. Then the second one has to deal with how to protect our external borders. And then, of course, these people are coming in and applying. Either they are legal, either they are refugees, or they are beneficiaries of subsidiary protection, or displaced persons, or they are economic refugees, or simply illegal migrants, because there are also many people suffering from acts of crime. Human trafficking is the main example in this context. So, and that's not necessarily the Syrians, but many people victim of human trafficking, women trafficking, sexually abused, children even, and so forth and so further, smuggling, and so forth. So we have to deal with that as well. So that's in fact how to deal once these people arrive, make an application. How do you assess their situation? Are they in need of protection, or simply are they to be considered simply illegal? What should be done in case after a while? So we have now paved the way for procedures, certain deadlines, 6 months, ultimately 1 year, how to assess the merits of an application for asylum or at least international protection. So once they are legal, of course, you have to draw the conclusions from that. And then, of course, we have to decide where are these people going to. And, of course, again, there is an ID, and then, of course, I remind you again to these principles of solidarity and burden sharing, that they have to be distributed. But it could also be that, for example, in Greece or in Italy, so this southern member state, there is a certain willingness to receive them, to accept them as not as a national, but as a citizen in Greece, in Italy. They accept them having access to the labor market because well-educated Syrian people might be welcome in Greece or in Italy or whatsoever. But essentially also in this context, once we are dealing with legal migration, we have to draw the conclusions from how to apply principles of solidarity and burden sharing as well. And if they are illegal, in the end, then of course, either you have to punish them or you have to send them back. But that's an issue which is also not very easy to accomplish. How are you going to send back all these people coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, perhaps even from safe third countries? When we were in the 2015, the Balkan route, when Frau Merkel, so Angela Merkel, made this famous expression of "Wir schaffen das," we will do it. We can solve this problem. Then, of course, many people from Serbia, from Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, they were willing to come to Germany. But obviously, they were not really welcome in Germany, because then you have to apply, yes, but you are not a person in need of protection. You are originating from a country which essentially is a candidate member state of the European Union. So we consider you as a safer country. So you have no title, you're not entitled to stay in Germany or in Austria or in Hungary or in the Netherlands or in Sweden or wherever. You simply have to be moved back. And that, of course, is another issue. It's another drama, has been a drama. And there, of course, you can profit partly from the fact that European Union, of course, in the course of the decades, has developed economic relationships with all these third countries. Afghanistan, it was very impressive, by the way, that certain member states considered Afghanistan a safe third country, whereas others didn't recognize Afghanistan as a safe third country. So although, that's for tomorrow, we apply the same rules, responsible member state, how to receive, qualification of refugee and procedures and whatsoever, when there is not a common agreement on a concept, what is a safe third country, then of course the whole situation, although applying the same rules, but you come to different conclusions, which of course is also a very odd kind of situation in the context of the European Union, which is supposed to develop a common policy, also with regard to safe third countries. Now, Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, and whatsoever, these are relatively clear cases. So they were all moved back, were refused access to Germany at the time. You may remember that in Munich, when they arrived by hundreds of people, also from the Balkans, they had to be sent back. But how to do that? That requires also an organization. And as I told you, so in the course of decades, the EU has concluded agreements with, relatively speaking, all safe, civilized third countries, so that you can connect it to a partnership agreement with Serbia. I mean, they are in the waiting room to become a member state of the European Union, so it's relatively easy to send people back to the Balkans, the Western Balkans. However, it's more complicated when we are dealing with Pakistan, Afghanistan, or countries in Africa where there is some doubt whether they are to be considered as safe third countries, yes or no. Anyway, that is the other issue where we have to, and there is a fourth issue which is becoming more and more important, and that is indeed the reference to legal migration. So in view of the demographic developments, so the population in Europe becoming older and older, gray hairs like mine and so on. So we have to realize that it may be that on the labor market we need more migrants coming from third countries, on the condition, of course, that they are qualified and professionally capable to play a useful role on our labor market, etc., etc. So several dimensions we are confronted with how to deal with the migration crisis. We were not able to do that in 2015, in 2016. Since that Turkey agreement, we have at least facilitated your position, the Greek islands, etc., because I've brought some slides about it. The numbers of migrants went down in a very important way, and obviously the fact that, of course, most of the Syrian migrants left their countries in 2014, 2015, but now they're still coming, but in numbers which are not to be compared with the situation when the crisis was really up to the limit, so to say. And perhaps a final issue is this really a European problem? Are we supposed to deal with all the migrants coming from countries poorer or in a situation of conflict? Why the hell has it been possible that we have accepted all the migrants coming in? Why didn't we try at least to invoke solidarity also from other stable areas in the world? At that time, 2015, 2014, obviously you can refer to continents like the Americas, Australia, New Zealand. And at a certain moment I was also thinking why Russia doesn't take a share in this problem. Now certainly since Russia started to bombard and intervene actively in the civil war, they were more or less excluded. They, at least in my perspective, are not to be considered as being very helpful in that respect. But why it has been so that this has become a European problem, although from the origin it is not a European problem. Why did they come to Europe? Well, of course, geographically it's very simple. We are a stable, we are a peaceful, economically relative, prosperous area, and we were in the neighborhood. Well, in the neighborhood, that means you have to cross the Mediterranean, which we have noticed has caused a lot of casualties, but nevertheless, we are a stable, peaceful, economically relative, prosperous area in the neighborhood, say they come. But I have never understood why not at the political level we have invoked assistance by the United States or Southern America, why not? Or Australia and New Zealand, and perhaps some countries in Africa as well. I don't know, South Africa, why not? Why didn't they made their share in this problem? In fact, they did, and I have one slide on that. And I must warn you because of the slides. The origin is different. Sometimes they are from the Council, sometimes from the European Commission, sometimes from think tanks. So take it with a margin of discretion, but nevertheless it's enlightening. So the US also has accepted a number of migrants, and the Canadians also. But we remember very, very, very clearly Mr. Trudeau receiving families, so well selected because of the academic qualifications, professional capacities of these migrants. They were selected and being welcomed. 10 people, 20 people, 35 perhaps, but in very small numbers. Whereas you here in Greece or in Italy were confronted with thousands per day, so to say. I mean, so and I think that situation has not really changed that much. But still, I think it's still an issue which should come on the table. By the way, it is on the table, but it's a bit late. And that's the whole issue, the whole problem of the EU. So our first conclusion was this is a European responsibility. We have to deal with what's happening at our external borders. We were not capable to do it. We are now trying to repair and to improve the situation politically and also from a legislative perspective. We're getting somewhere, but still it is a bit strange that we accepted this as a essentially European responsibility. So that's the first part of my presentation. I don't know whether that provokes some questions or comments. They're always very welcome, but perhaps it's a good idea to have then a break now and in 20 minutes time, and then I will present this presentation with some statistics and photograph. Is that okay?
Of course. I just have a question.
Yes, of course. Oh, you have to use the microphone. In fact, I have two microphones. Can I not share one of them?
No.
Okay.
Thank you. You mentioned that other countries, third countries, inter alia countries, African countries could assume some of the responsibility of dealing with the refugee crisis. And I had the impression that these countries, although not necessarily signatories of the Geneva Convention, they do host large numbers of refugees, not necessarily Syrians, but Yemenis or Malians or things like that. So I was wondering whether, especially in relation to Africa, this would be a realistic perspective to charge them.
Yeah, Africa is perhaps a special example, but a country like Saudi Arabia, do you know how many migrants Saudi Arabia has received? It's very close to zero, very close to zero. I mean, is it a stable country? Well, I do not like to live there, I think, but politically speaking, I think it's a relatively stable country. But they've received up to zero. No, I share your point, but I think relatively speaking, we have taken 90% of all the charges and the workload on our shoulders. And we were able, not prepared to do it, we were not capable to deal with all these problems. Slightly the situation goes better, and still, essentially, the problems have not been solved. Because, of course, the starting point of all the issues is the region of origin. And again, I think that's a new dimension that our political leaders, and the reference again is to this Africa-EU summit in November last year, has now also inscribed on our agenda how to stabilize the countries by making investments in Niger, in Eritrea, but of course difficult to the extent that these countries, when they do not have a political stable regime, it's very difficult to require from businessmen or women or from enterprises to go into that area and to try to make the best of it by making available financial resources, creating employment, etc., etc.
I also have a second question, which is a judgment question. If we look at the numbers, we see that there is, like you said, that we got 90% of the burden. But if you look at the actual numbers, we're talking about some 100,000, maybe 1 million. And I'm wondering, and this is something how, I mean, is it that much of a real problem, or is it more of a political problem that we're discussing, or is so intensively? Because 1 million refugees in a Europe of 700...
Yes, no, that's also, that's a good point. That's also a good point. So, indeed, I mean, on an overall population, how many are we? If we exclude the United Kingdom, but if we still include them, how many are we? 500 million. And we're referring to up to 1 million, perhaps. So what is it? 1 out of 15, not as yet 2%, and it's less. It's less than 2%. So in a way, you're right. So essentially, it's a political problem. But nevertheless, you see the impact migration has on national societies, more particularly Germany, was an example. We all remember the cruel events taking place 2016, 2017, it has an impact on it has an impact, it provokes populism. Also in my country, in the Netherlands, I mean, they're playing with the migration crisis, so the population has become important because of the fact that we were still experiencing economic crisis and migration crisis on top of that. So it has an impact on national society. So it's political and a little bit more. But number-wise, we should be able to absorb the problem as long as we're not trying to protect people with bad intentions, terrorists and so on, because that's also a dimension of the problem. England, for example, Manchester, London, and these kind of things. Complicated. Well, that's a bird's eye view of the problem. To try to make it somewhat more concrete, in the second part of our meeting, let's go through the presentation. Yes, other questions, perhaps? Think about it over the break, and we will meet again in 20 minutes or so. Is that reasonable? Good.